Hi, everybody. Welcome to this month's Tailoring of the Month. For this month, we're going to be going over filtering a form. So this is a little bit of an interesting tailoring of the month. It actually plays into our learning lab for this month as well. So for anybody that's going to be attending the learning lab, you'll recognize the form we're building in that lab. So what I'm talking about today is we're going to look at a really good way to satisfy needs of some specific industries and verticals and create forms that are, completely unique forms that do a unique process, but utilizing a very standard transaction. So that's what filtering a form does for us. So for example, today we're going to be building an expired batch issue form, and that's going to be using the standard goods issue form as a base and just the goods issue transaction as our transaction, but it's only going to issue out expired batches. And the way we're going to do that is really cool. I know just talking about it up front doesn't sound that interesting, but you'll see in a few minutes here how that really works. Before we get into that, I am going to show you an out-of-the-box example of this, which is our put-away form, just to help you visualize and understand how filtering a form works and how much it can drastically change the meaning and use case of that form. So first here, I'm going to go to my desktop and we are going to go ahead and open up Form Studio here. So remember, Form Studio FS is for handheld applications. So I'm just going to double click there. And basically, the first thing I'm going to do is give you this use case example of how put away works, and that should help you understand what we're really going to be building here. So first, I'm going to go to my Agility Essentials FS folder here. And inside of Agility Essentials FS, we're just going to scroll down and find put away, and we're going to take a look at that form. So put away, if you're not familiar with it, is a very simple form, right? What put away does is if you have a receiving bin set, when you do GRPO on the handheld, you receive those items directly into that receiving bin, and then put away is performed taking items out of that receiving bin and moving them into standard inventory. So as you can see here, as compared, if we take a look at our regular bin transfer form, bin transfer, you tell it all the information, right? There's no filtering going on. So if you compare put away to that, you have bin first and it's defaulted in. So if I simulate here, you'll see it's defaulted in based off of my receiving bin. So what's happening in the background is just a simple bin transfer, right? I'm just moving items out of my put away bin or my receiving bin into regular inventory after a goods receipt PO is done. So I receive those items, they go right into my receiving bin, and then later I put those away into, standard bin locations. So this form filters based on bin. So first off, it automatically assigns bin based on what the receiving bin is there. But then the filtering happens in the background where the bin transaction is going to use that bin as your from bin. It's only going to show you items that do in fact reside in this bin and quantities for those items in this bin, right? So if you pick an item, it's not going to show you the entire quantity for that item in the warehouse. It's showing you the quantity that item has in your receiving bin. And then it's also going to remove your receiving bin from your list of bin locations to move the item to, because obviously you can't do a bin transfer from, the same bin to the same bin. So as you can see here, there's a filtering piece of information. That's the point I want to get across. That receiving bin, that affects how the entire form functions. Everything it functions based off of that receiving bin for the rest of, the time that you work inside of this form. And that filters how this form functions. So that's the main key piece of information I want you to understand here. When we talk about filtering a form, we can change completely the functionality of a form, because this obviously does have very different functionality from our regular bin transfer form. We can change that functionality completely with this one piece of filtering information. So that's what we're going to be doing for our batch issue form here. And now we can go ahead and get into making that. So first thing, we are using the standard out of the box goods issue form to create this. But that being said, we want to make sure that we are making a copy of that form and doing it in a custom project, because your projects can be overridden whenever Wisys is updated if they are just in standard projects, right? Your forms can be overwritten if they're in standard projects. So for example, if I just go in there and make changes to the standard out of the box goods issue form in our Agility Essentials project, and then I update Wisys, that form will be overridden to the most current version of the goods issue form in the standard Wisys project, right? So we don't want to do that. I know I mention that every time, but it's just very important to remember because you don't want to lose your work. So you want to create a new project. If you don't have one already, you could just make a new one and call that tailoring of the month or batch issue form or something like that. I have a tailoring of the month custom project here that will not be overridden that I've already made. So I'm just going to go ahead and open that up. And then from inside of there, we're simply going to go in and make a copy of our standard goods issue form. So I'm going to go up to copy form here, copy form from, or copy from form. And we're just going to type in goods issue here. And here, if I expand the names, I just want this goods issue from our standard Agility Essentials folder. Just double click on that. And now I'm going to change the name here to expired batch issue. I'm going to use the same description there as well. Now that'll open up. We have our new form. It does say goods issue here at the top. I don't want it to say that, so I'm going to clear out the form terms ID. If you haven't seen videos where I talk about this before, terms ID allows us to do language translation. So, the original goods issue has that ID in there. So if you have your handheld in Spanish or French instead of English, it will say goods issue in that language. So in this case, we lose language translation because I'm naming this something unique. I could obviously go and add the translations into the system. I could add terms IDs if I want to. Any customer or partner can do that. But for right now, I'm not really worried about that for, our purposes today. So now we have our named expired batch issue form. And now we can talk a little bit about how this is going to function exactly, right? So I'm going to add in a piece of information at the top that's my expired batch field. That field is only going to show me expired batches in the system, and we'll talk about how we're doing that. And then when an expired batch is selected, you'll notice very quickly all of this information, except for batch, which is going to go away. I'm going to remove that because now I'm going to have a new batch field satisfying that batch requirement. So I can just remove that now. Oh, that was weird. Okay, they're back. My names are back after I saved. Now I have removed batch off of the form here. And then my new expired batch field is going to be placed at the top. Will tell us what the warehouse of that batch is, what item it belongs to, that item's description and inventory unit of measure, what bin that batch is sitting in, the total quantity available. And then I'm also going to default the quantity to match the quantity available because we're going to operate off the assumption that if I'm issuing batches out of the system that are expired, 90% of the time, I'm just going to want to issue that entire group of lots or batches, right? I'm going to want to issue them all because they're all expired. But while that's the expectation that we're operating off of, I do want to give the user the ability to overwrite that in certain cases. So I am going to give them the ability to clear this field out, and we'll talk about how I'm going to do that and change the quantity if they want to before proceeding. And that would help in cases where, maybe the system says there's 16 of a batch, they only find 9, so they want to issue out the 9 now, go look for the remaining 7 before issuing them out of the system, something like that. So that's how this is going to work. And again, we know all of that information because we're selecting a batch up front. That batch is obviously tied to an item in a warehouse, in a bin in that warehouse, right? So we can get all the information we need. So I'm going to add a new text lookup field. This is going to be my expired batch field. So first we'll give it that caption. We'll just call it EXP batch. Tab down, and then I'm going to change the name of that field. This is the name how it would appear in like the XML. So for troubleshooting purposes, I always recommend, you've probably heard me say it before, it's good to name it TXT and then, like expired batch or whatever the field name is, because that allows us to know if we're troubleshooting um, in the XML of the form. When we see TXT, we know, okay, that's a text field, right? Or if we see a button, we know, okay, BT, that's a button, right? So it allows us to quickly grasp what we're looking at in that XML. All right, now this expired batch field is going to be our filtering piece of information. So I'm going to move it to the top of the form because it needs to be the first thing we decide. I'll go ahead and save there. And now the form's set up. Again, trickle down effect, right? We're going to select our expired batch. Everything else is going to fill in. Pretty simple. This is going to be really just a two-step form. And you'll see what this looks like at the end. Don't worry, we will test that plenty. So now we can start by defining the lookup for our expired batch. So I'm going to click here to define my lookup SQL. And I'm going to click on advanced. And here I can add a query. As I say every month with these tailoring of the month videos, this is not a query writing class, so I have a pre-written query here. Just speeds things up for me, makes it easier. I don't have to test things back and forth and try and make sure I have the right query while I'm doing this video. I can just drop it in. But you can see pretty simple what we're doing here. So this is just our lookup, right? This is where we select what expired batch we're using. So in our lookup to the screen, I want to pull the item the batch belongs to, the total quantity of that batch, the batch number, and I'm going to call it batch instead of dis number, and then the expiration date of that batch. Then I'm going to filter that to have my expiration date be lower than today's date. The reason being, of course, we want products that expired before today. That means they're expired. We don't want them in the system anymore. So this is only going to give us products that are already expired. And then I also want to clear out any on-hand quantities that are 0 or negative, just in case I have any data integrity issues in here or anything like that. I want to clear those out because obviously we're not going to issue a negative batch or a batch of 0 out of the system, right? If I have a batch that's sitting at -2, I'm going to want to do a receipt to get that back to 0 if that's supposed to be 0, or if it is 0, it really shouldn't be hanging around in there. So, in this case, we don't want to see any zeros or negatives. I'm going to save. And once that loads in here, we're going to select a return field. The return field is going to be what's passed to the actual field on the screen of the form, which is of course going to be that dis number, which is our actual batch number. And that's what that field is, our expired batch. So now I can save this and we can look at how this operates, right? So if I go to simulate here and I click my lookup, we'll see I have a list here of expired batches, and I do have a lot in my system, so this is looking accurate so far. We have item code. Obviously, this is a little crammed. It's a lot of information on the screen, but you could play with that if you decide you don't need to see the actual batch number on here or something like that. You can play with it, right, and change the way the screen looks. But right now, I want all of this information, so I can say, okay, first I have this batch. Okay, it's SW190530 for item FS Suite W. There's 19 of them, and the expiration date was 8/28/2019. I have all that information readily available, but now I want to check my filterings here in my lookup. So first, we know these batches should all be expired. So if I sort, it goes all the way back to 2019, which makes sense to me because I do have a bunch of, old bad data in my system. Or we can scroll all the way down to 2023, which is good. If our last batch is 8/10 of 2023, I'm pretty confident I have expiration dates in here past 2024. We don't see anything past 2024. So we know, okay, that filtering is correct. Now let's check the on-hand quantity. So if we go here, scroll all the way to the top, our lowest on-hand quantity is 1. So there you go. That's working correctly as well. We are only looking at on-hand quantities that are above 0. So now I have this filtering working correctly. Let's go ahead and pick a batch. I'm going to do 190605, click it, and it does in fact return that batch number to our expired batch field. So far what we set up is working correctly, right? We have that lookup that is going to force the rules of how this form should work, which those rules are that we should only be able to select expired batches. That is now set up correctly. A user can come in here, pick a batch from the list, and be confident it is expired because of the filtering that we did on the lookup. So now we have that. It's only showing them expired batches. Now we need to fill in all this additional information. So the key piece here is we need to set a variety of things automatically based on the batch selected. Again, this form is intended to filter based on the batch selected. So that's the goal here. All this information is already known in SQL. So we're just going to grab that information and set it in the right spots. For the most part, that's just things on the screen, but it is always worthwhile to check our transaction. So if we go here into actions on our OK button, our save button, we need to check this transaction, goods issue post. That's the one that will actually use the information for the item and batch and so on and so forth. And we want to go to object properties, and we'll notice we have a few variables here. We have this BPID, which I don't care about that. I'm not going to worry about setting that today. It doesn't really affect the functionality of the form. So right now, I don't feel like that's necessary. If I want to go back and make sure that's covered later, I can do that. It's just, I didn't feel like adding it to my query. All right. And then we need bin abs. This text batch, though, needs to change because we removed that field. That field doesn't exist anymore. We need to change it to text expired batch, which is our new batch field that tells us what batch we're using. So now we've changed that to text expired batch. We can go back to our parameters. None of these are set. These will all need set. So we will go set them. And then we also have to set that variable for our bin abs in the background to tell it what bin we're going to. So we can go ahead and close out of that there, save our form. So now our action, if we check it one more time, has that correct batch field, our expired batch field. Yep, perfect. Now we're going to want to add an action to this expired batch field that is going to set those fields automatically in the background. So we're going to use a SQL event. SQL event allows us to essentially write our own validation here, and that validation is going to pull back this data that we need and automatically fill it in on the form. I'm going to click advanced. And once again, I pre-wrote my SQL script here. I'm going to copy and drop that in. It's a long one, so let's talk about it. Here, what we're doing is we're grabbing our item code for the batch and setting that as the item field on the form, so the actual field you'll see. Same thing here, grabbing item name, setting it as item description field, grabbing our inventory unit of measure, setting that as our unit of measure field, warehouse for warehouse field, bin code for bin field. Then we are going to grab the bins abs entry and set that as the bins abs in the background because I looked in advance at my transaction and knew, okay, I need to grab the actual abs to make that work. I can't just use the bin code. I need the actual abs. So we grab that. And then again, we're going to take that on-hand quantity and set that for both quantity available and text quantity because we're operating off of the assumption that they're almost always going to want to issue out the entire quantity. So we're setting all of that and we're doing it where our dis number for all of this information equals the dis number that we've already selected, which is our text expired batch. So basically, cut and dry, plain and simple. All these fields fill in based off of that text expired batch that we selected in our first step. So all of this will just happen automatically once we select a batch. So I'm going to save that. And because this functions as a validation, you do want to put a validation error message in there. And this is helpful because let's say somebody just picks up the gun, scans a batch, and that batch doesn't exist in the system. Maybe they just type in 330 and that's not a batch. We want to give an error message back that batch number does not exist. And save that. And I did realize one thing here. I do want to probably add the same logic that we talked about before with are checking to make sure the expiration date is actually expired and checking to make sure that quantity is not zero, because the user does have the ability to scan in a batch or type in a batch here. So like I mentioned before, we want to make sure they're not typing in a batch that doesn't exist in the system, but we also want to make sure they're using an expired batch that is not sitting at a quantity of zero, right? So in this case, I'm going to go back into my action here, and I am going to add in those same filtering fields that I used for my lookup. So I'm just going to open my action back up real quick and add that in. So I go down here to advanced, I'm just going to copy and paste the same items from the where statement and the lookup right into there. All right, so now we're filtering to make sure it is expired and it does have a quantity greater than zero. And I do notice right here too, I would have a problem. The script that I just dropped in here has this field named text expiration batch or expired batch. That is no longer the name. So I want to go ahead and clear that out. So I did name that differently this time. I skipped the A in there, and we can validate that. Now everything will look normal again. So we have our correct text expired batch. It's going to make sure that batch is existing in the system, the batch that we selected. Then we're going to check and make sure that the product is expired. And then we are also going to make sure the quantity is greater than zero, because we don't want to make that problem worse by, issuing out a negative quantity or a quantity of zero. All right, I'm going to save and close here. Now, before we test this, there's one more thing we want to do. Going back to that functionality I talked about, when it comes to allowing the user to change the quantity they're going to issue out, we are operating off the assumption that the vast majority of the time this quantity is just going to be the full quantity available, but we want them to have that ability to do that. So we need to change two things on the form here so that they can change that quantity. First, we need to go here to the form, and we need to scroll down and find our default execution. And we need to change that from on last item to after last item. When it's on last item, the way the form would work right now is when we select our expired batch, since all that information is going to automatically fill in here, it would just go ahead and process the transaction and issue out that full quantity, because we're filling in that full quantity automatically. So that last item is filling in automatically. So if it's on last item, it gets filled in immediately. So it would just process the transaction without us touching anything. We don't want that. So we're going to move it to last after last item, which means everything will fill in, but then we're still going to be required to hit enter or save one more time. So we're going to add that. And then on the quantity field here, we are also, so we want to make sure we have quantity field selected. We are also going to scroll down, make sure allow clear is set to true, which it is in fact set to true, so we can clear that field out. But then we also want to put a clear stop on it. So we're going to set that to true, which will ensure that whenever we do clear the field out, that nothing else is going to get cleared, because we want to make sure we keep all that other information that we set. So we just want to clear the quantity field, and the clear stops allows us to stop the clear after quantity is cleared out. So now this form should function the way we want it to function. It's going to fill in everything automatically when we select an expired batch, but it's going to give us the ability to check over it before processing or click clear to change the quantity that we're going to issue out. So let's go ahead and simulate here. So I'm just going to select this FMR product here, this FMR SPRODA. Our batch is B190603B with a quantity of 3 there. But first I'm going to hit clear, and I'm going to change that quantity, and we're going to go ahead and issue out 1. But before we even do that, I want to pull up Agility Explorer here and go to my batch availability grid. That way we have a second point of truth here that we're checking against to make sure everything looks correct. So B190603B, B190603B. Oh, this is the one right here. We have our quantity of 3 there in bin 05D. Let's check back and make sure that's the correct bin. Yep, bin 05D, quantity of 3. Everything is perfect there. And now we are going to go ahead and issue that product out. So here's our batch. We're going to watch that drop from 3 to 2 because we're just going to issue one out. So here we go. Make sure that all moves freely. And there's a label for our issued product. Now I could have this clear automatically. I'm not going to do that though. I'm just going to clear it out myself and we'll go back to that same batch here. And we want to check our grid. If I refresh, this quantity here should drop to 2. Perfect. So we issued out one of those items. Now we're going to issue the rest and make sure it drops off the grid. But first, I want to test typing in here a random batch number that doesn't exist and make sure nothing happens here. So I'm just going to hit a bunch of numbers and some characters. That should not be a batch. And there we go. We got our batch does not exist error. So that's perfect. In this case, I probably should change that error too, now that we added some more criteria to say something like batch does not exist or is not expired, something like that, but we can worry about that later. Now let's go ahead and issue out the rest of this item here. So I can just go with B190603B again. If I go in here, B190603B. And you can see there's a couple different sets of it because there's different bins, right? As we saw before. We're just going to pick that one that has 2 and save and do the entire quantity here. Print the screen, and there is our label. And if we jump back here once more to Agility Explorer and refresh, this line should drop off the grid completely. And there you go. Now that item is issued out of the system. We successfully issued out our batch item. Now, one more thing to look at here, just because I'm sure it's a question you're wondering, is what would happen if I just type in that batch number, since there's multiple different lines because it's in several different bins. Let's go ahead and take a look at that. So we're going to type in that batch B190603B. And you're going to see it's going to go ahead and default to one of the specific bins for us. So we want to make sure we understand that functionality too there and how we can change those things about the lookup. Of course, in this case, the lookup kind of has to function that way, right? Because we're automatically filling in the bin and everything like that. But after our clear stop, we could add another clear stop on bin. And we could also add functionality that whenever a bin is selected, it would grab the quantity from that bin. So we could clear again, it would clear out the bin, select a new bin, and then it would set those quantities based on the bin we chose. There's a lot deeper ways we should go into this form to make sure we prevent any type of possible error. But it's important to note that what we're trying to get across today is how you filter a form and all the steps you want to go through to add that filtering to the form. And that's what we successfully did here. So again, because this item could be in multiple different bins, there might be some different things that we want to do here to clean things up to make sure they have the right bin selected or anything like that. But all in all, when we talk about filtering a form, we have that ability here to now enter in the expired batch or grab that expired batch from a list of expired batches, right? So we can see all of our expired batches here on a list, pick a batch there, and that would automatically fill in all of our information as well as quantity. We do have that ability as well that we intended to have to go in there and change that quantity before we process the transaction. But now everything is pretty much automated unless we decide that we want to do a different quantity other than the full quantity. So we successfully created our filtered form here. That's what I wanted to show you for this week. I am going to talk about this form a little bit in my learning lab this month. So if you want to see it in action a little more, come attend that learning lab. But now you know how to tailor a form to have filtering, very similar to how our put away form works. And we took the functionality of just the standard goods issue form here and made it into a whole new form of its own, right? Now this goods issue form only issues out expired batch products, and we can only see expired batch products in it. So Yeah, completely different functionality just by adding one field at the top and filtering everything else based on that field selected. Thanks for watching.